Welcome back. I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from. I always love knowing who's drifting off with me. If you enjoy slow, haunting stories that gently carry you towards sleep, consider liking and subscribing so more of these can find you. Now, get comfortable. Let your body grow still. Let the outside world fade into silence. Tonight, as the night grows quieter, the shadows begin to whisper and another haunting story unfolds. So, close your eyes, listen carefully, and let yourself drift into this. My Aunt Marguerite left me the house on Wraithmore Close when she died, and I remember thinking it was a strange kind of inheritance. A house nobody in the family ever visited, left to a niece nobody in the family ever mentioned in the same breath as love. I found out on a Tuesday in a solicitor's office that smelled of instant coffee and old carpet glue. A woman named Mrs. Pell sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk toward me, like she was dealing a card she didn't want to hold anymore. She named you specifically, Mrs. Pell said. Not your mother, not your sister. You. I remember laughing, a short, disbelieving sound, because that felt like the strangest detail in a strange week. I hadn't seen Marguerite in 11 years, not since I was 22, and too busy building a life I thought mattered more than family gatherings I found tedious, and full of old grievances I didn't understand. She'd sent a card on my birthday most years, the handwriting getting shakier, the messages getting shorter, until eventually they stopped altogether, and I hadn't noticed for almost 2 years that they had. That's the kind of guilt that doesn't announce itself. It just sits in you, quiet, waiting for an occasion to surface. Her death gave it one. The drive out to Wraithmore took just under 3 hours, motorway giving way to A roads, then B roads, then finally a single-track lane that wound up through bare hills the colour of wet slate. The sat-nav lost signal twice. By the time I found the turning, a gap in a hedgerow so overgrown I nearly missed it. The light was already dropping into that grey, directionless hour where day and evening seem to argue over which one owns the sky. The house sat at the top of a short rise, and my first proper look at it came through the windscreen, wipers dragging intermittently against a fine drizzle that had started somewhere around the last village. Grey stone, 3 stories, a roofline broken by 2 ornate chimneys that looked like they belonged to a much grander building than the one attached to them. Ivy had taken most of the east wall, thick ropes of it curling into window frames, prying at mortar that had probably been failing since before I was born. The garden, if you could still call it that, had gone entirely feral, brambles reaching waist-high across what must once have been a lawn. A rose arbor collapsed under its own tangled weight near the front step. I sat in the car for a long moment before I got out. I want to be honest about that, because everything that happened afterward makes more sense if you understand that I felt something the moment I saw the house, before I ever crossed its threshold. A kind of pressure behind my sternum, a wrongness I couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. I told myself it was nerves, grief maybe, for a woman I hadn't properly grieved because I hadn't let myself think about her in years. I told myself a lot of things in that car, sitting with the engine ticking as it cooled, rain starting to bead on the windscreen glass. The estate agent I'd spoken to on the phone, a cheerful, slightly too fast-talking man named Desmond, had called it a wonderful restoration project, 3 separate times in a 15-minute conversation, which in retrospect should have told me everything. What he meant, I would learn, was that the house needed more work than money could easily fix, and that the work wasn't only structural. I called it penance. That was the word that came to me as I finally opened the car door and stepped out into the cold, damp air, gravel crunching underfoot, the smell of wet earth, and something else beneath it, something green and slightly rotten, like compost left too long. Penance for 11 years of silence, Penance for birthday cards I'd stopped reading properly, skimming them for the gift card tucked inside and setting the rest aside without absorbing a word. Penance, I told myself, standing at the base of the front steps with the house's dark windows, watching me the way old houses always seem to watch, patient, unblinking, faintly amused. The key Mrs. Pell had given me was heavy, old-fashioned, the kind you don't see anymore outside of period dramas. And it took some working to turn in a lock that clearly hadn't been oiled in years. The door swung inward with a groan that felt almost theatrical, and the smell that rolled out to meet me was the first thing I properly noticed. Dust, certainly, the particular staleness of a house that's been shut up and unloved, but underneath that, something else, something I couldn't place yet. I would come to know that smell intimately over the following weeks. That first evening, I only registered it as strange, filed it away with all the other strange things I was choosing not to examine too closely, and stepped inside. The hallway swallowed the last of the daylight almost immediately. I fumbled for a switch, found one, and a single bulb flickered reluctantly to life somewhere above me, casting long, uncertain shadows across faded wallpaper and a staircase that curved up into darkness I couldn't see the top of. Portraits lined the wall going up. Not of Marguerite, I realized, looking closer, but older. Much older. Faces I didn't recognize, dressed in clothes from decades before my aunt was even born, watching me from behind cracked varnish with the particular blankness of old photographs, the kind of gaze that seems to follow you no matter where you stand. I told myself I'd fix the place up, sell it, be done with her memory, and with whatever guilt I'd been carrying about the years I'd let slip between us. 6 weeks, maybe 8, I thought, standing in that hallway with my bag still in my hand, and the door not yet closed behind me. Clear it out, patch what needed patching, hand it to an agent, and go back to my actual life, the one with deadlines and takeaway coffee, and people who didn't leave houses to nieces they hadn't spoken to in over a decade. I didn't know yet, standing there in that dim, watchful hallway, that the house had other plans for me entirely. I didn't know that Marguerite's silence, those 11 years of birthday cards growing shorter and shakier until they stopped, had never really been her choice at all, and that somewhere beneath the dust sheets and locked doors of that house was an explanation I was going to spend the next several weeks wishing I had never gone looking for. I closed the door behind me. The sound it made, echoing up through that dark stairwell, was the last ordinary sound I would hear in that house for a long time. The first night, I noticed the smell properly, not the general staleness that greeted me at the door, that had faded into background noise within the hour, the way any strange smell does once your nose adjusts. This was different. It arrived later, after I'd hauled my bags upstairs, after I'd found a bedroom that seemed less abandoned than the others, and made a half-hearted attempt at settling in, laying my sleeping bag over a mattress I didn't fully trust, and telling myself the proper bed linens could wait until daylight, when I could see what I was dealing with. It came somewhere around 11, drifting into the room from the hallway outside, thin at first, easy to dismiss, not damp, not the mildew smell I'd half expected, given the state of the ivy outside, something sweeter, almost floral, in the way old perfume can be floral, cloying, slightly wrong, like a scent designed decades ago for a chemistry that doesn't quite match modern noses. And beneath that sweetness, so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, something metallic, like a coin held too long in a closed, sweating fist, like the smell of your own hands after counting change. I lay there in the dark, sleeping bag pulled to my chin despite the mild evening, listening to the house settle around me, old wood ticking as it cooled, a draft finding some gap in a window frame and worrying at it with a low, breathy whistle, and I tried to place the smell's source. It seemed to come from the hallway specifically, from the direction of a door 2 along from mine that I hadn't yet opened. Mrs. Pell's inventory sheet had labelled it, in her neat solicitor's hand, simply as principal bedroom. I got up eventually, curiosity winning out over the tired, sensible part of me that wanted only to sleep. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet, and the hallway, when I stepped into it with my phone's torch held out ahead of me like a talisman, seemed longer than it had by daylight. An illusion, surely, of darkness and unfamiliarity, though I noted the thought, and didn't much like how quickly my mind had reached for the word illusion, as though some other part of me already suspected it might not be one. The principal bedroom door wasn't locked. It swung open at a touch, hinges silent in a way that struck me, even then, as strange. Everything else in that house creaked, every door, every stair, and yet this one moved without a sound, as though it had been recently oiled, or as though it simply opened often enough that rust never had the chance to take hold. Inside, my torch beam found a 4-poster bed, and my first thought, absurd, given everything I would come to understand about that house, was how tidy it looked. Sheets yellowed with age but tucked with a precision that seemed almost military, hospital corners crisp despite the dust that had settled over everything else in the room like a grey shroud. A dressing table with an oval mirror spotted with age. A wardrobe, heavy and dark, pushed against the far wall, and the smell, here, unmistakably here, thick enough that I found myself breathing through my mouth. Sweetness and copper tangled together in a combination that made something ancient and animal in the back of my brain want very badly to leave the room. I told myself old houses smell strange. I said it out loud, actually, standing there in that doorway, with my torch beam trembling slightly across those 2 neat sheets. Said it the way you say something you're trying to convince yourself of, rather than something you actually believe. I told myself a lot of things that week, that the house had simply absorbed decades of whatever perfumes and habits its previous occupants had brought with them, and that smells like that don't just vanish. They linger in fabric and plaster, the way smoke lingers in curtains, long after the cigarette's been stubbed out. That the metallic note was old pipes, or rust in the water tank, or a dozen other mundane explanations I reached for and discarded in quick succession, none of them quite fitting, all of them better than the alternative, which was that I didn't yet have language for. I went back to bed that night without opening the wardrobe, though I remember standing in front of it for a long moment, hand almost on the handle, before some instinct, not quite fear, not yet, more a kind of held-breath caution, pulled me back into the hallway and shut the door behind me. Sleep came slowly and badly. I drifted in and out, aware at some point of the smell reaching even my own room, thin tendrils of it curling under my door the way smoke might, though there was no fire anywhere in that cold house. I remember thinking, in the strange, unmoored logic of half-sleep, that the house was exhaling, that it had been holding its breath for years, decades maybe, waiting for someone to arrive and give it a reason to let that breath go. By morning, the smell had faded to something almost imperceptible, and daylight did what daylight always does to nighttime fears. Shrank them down to a manageable size, made them foolish, easy to laugh at over a cup of instant coffee made with water boiled in a kettle I'd found still plugged into a socket that, remarkably, still worked. I told myself it was nothing. I made a list of jobs for the day. Clear the kitchen, check the boiler, call someone about the ivy before it took the whole east wall down with it. And I did not put investigate the smell in the principal bedroom anywhere on that list, because writing it down would have meant admitting there was something to investigate. But it came back the next night, and the night after that. Some mornings it seemed stronger than others. Tuesday, I remember distinctly, waking with the sweetness of it thick enough in my throat that I gagged slightly, had to open every window on the landing despite the September chill, stood shivering in a jumper while cold air fought a losing battle against whatever was rising up through that house like sap through old wood. No matter how many windows I opened, no matter how much bleach I eventually used scrubbing down that principal bedroom from ceiling to floor. Certain some hidden mold or dead animal in the wall cavity was to blame. The smell persisted. It thinned sometimes, faded to something almost bearable, but it never left entirely. And by the end of that first week, lying awake in the dark, listening to the house breathe around me, I had stopped telling myself it was nothing, and started, very quietly, without quite admitting it to myself, to be afraid. There was one room Marguerite's solicitor had specifically warned me about, on that first grey afternoon in her carpet and coffee office, and it took me nearly 10 days to work up the nerve to go near it. "There's a study on the ground floor, east side," Mrs. Pell had said, not quite meeting my eyes as she said it, her pen tapping once against the desk, in a small, involuntary gesture I didn't understand the significance of until much later. "It's locked," newer lock than the rest of the house. She had it fitted herself, about 15 years ago, I believe, and bolted from the outside besides. I'd leave it be, if I were you, at least for a while. "Why?" I'd asked, the question feeling entirely reasonable at the time. Mrs. Pell had paused, and in that pause, I saw something flicker across her professional composure, not quite fear, but adjacent to it, a discomfort she was working hard to smooth over. "She was particular," she said finally, which wasn't an answer at all, though I didn't press further. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was simply the vague, slightly awkward language people use around the eccentricities of the recently deceased, the kind of careful non-answer you give when you don't want to speak ill of someone who can't defend themselves anymore. I turned that word over for days. Particular, it followed me through the mundane business of those first 10 days in the house, the calls to a roofer about the chimney, the trips into the village for supplies, the long hours spent simply sitting in rooms trying to decide what to keep and what to discard from a life I'd known almost nothing about. Every time I passed the study door on the ground floor, heavy, dark wood, a lock that did indeed look newer and more substantial than anything else in that house, a deadbolt fitted at eye level that seemed almost aggressive in its solidity, I felt that word pulse in the back of my mind, particular, as though it were trying to tell me something I wasn't yet equipped to hear. Curiosity beat caution, in the end, the way it usually does. It was a Thursday, overcast, the kind of flat grey light that makes a house feel smaller and more enclosed than it actually is, and I'd spent the morning failing to make progress on a leak in the upstairs bathroom, my hands raw from cold water and my patience worn thin. I found myself standing in front of that study door with a set of keys Mrs. Pell had given me, a heavy ring of them, unlabelled, that I'd been slowly matching to locks throughout the house over the previous week, one small triumph at a time. The fourth key I tried turned with a resistance that suggested the lock hadn't been used in some time, despite its relative newness, and the bolt slid back with a heavy, metallic finality that seemed to echo through the whole ground floor. I remember my hand hesitating on the handle. I remember, quite distinctly, the sensation of being watched, not by anything I could see, but by the house itself, by the portraits in the hallway, by the accumulated weight of whatever Marguerite had spent 15 years keeping locked away in this single room. I opened the door. The study was smaller than I expected, and colder, noticeably colder than the hallway I'd just come from, though I couldn't account for why, given there was no window open, no obvious draught. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture, pale shapes in the gloom that my mind, unhelpfully, kept rendering as sleeping figures rather than covered chairs and side tables. I pulled the nearest sheet back and found a writing desk, heavy oak, its surface clear except for a green-shaded lamp that clicked on, to my genuine surprise, when I tried the switch, meaning someone had kept this room connected to electricity, kept it maintained, in some fashion, even while keeping it locked away from the rest of the world. Filing cabinets stood against the far wall, 3 of them, each one locked with a small padlock that none of the keys on my ring seemed to fit. I would return to those cabinets later, with a set of bolt cutters bought specifically for the purpose, but that first day, my attention was captured entirely by what covered the wall above the desk. A corkboard, large, nearly the width of the wall itself, entirely covered in newspaper clippings, some yellowed with genuine age, others more recent, printed from what looked like online archives on an inkjet printer that had clearly been running low on black ink toward the end. Red string connected clipping to clipping in a dense, chaotic web that made my stomach drop the moment I properly registered what I was looking at. Missing persons notices, dozens of them, names I didn't recognize, faces staring out from photographs decades apart in style and quality. All of them, every single one, once I began reading the small, careful annotations Marguerite had made in the margins, connected somehow to this village, to this house, to a radius of a few square miles that seemed impossibly small to have swallowed so many people. I stood in that cold room for what felt like an hour, tracing the red string with my eyes, reading names off yellowed newsprint. Thomas Ashworth, aged 8, last seen. Cordelia Whitfield, aged 34, last seen. Peter Nash, aged 11, last seen. And felt something in my understanding of my aunt shift entirely, tectonic and irreversible. The eccentric recluse the family had quietly agreed to stop mentioning at dinner tables, the woman whose birthday cards grew shorter and stranger over the years until they stopped altogether, had apparently spent decades of her life alone in this cold, locked room, building a case, methodical, obsessive, evidence-based in a way that made my skin crawl, against something she believed had been operating in this village, undetected, for far longer than anyone else seemed willing to acknowledge. I closed the door behind me when I finally left, and I locked it again, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. Some instinct, perhaps, that whatever Marguerite had spent so long trying to contain deserved to stay contained a little longer, until I understood better what I was dealing with. I sat in the kitchen afterward with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands, staring at nothing, and I thought about the word particular until it stopped sounding like an evasion and started sounding, instead, like the truest thing anyone had told me since I'd arrived. I started asking questions in the village the following week, though asking questions makes it sound more deliberate than it actually was. The truth is that I couldn't stop myself, once I'd seen that corkboard, from probing gently at every conversation I had, testing for cracks, watching faces for the particular flinch I was beginning to recognize whenever the subject of Wraithmore Close came up. The village itself was small enough that everyone seemed to know within days that Marguerite's niece had moved into the old house on the hill, a fact I gathered mostly from the way conversations would pause fractionally when I walked into the post office or the small grocers on the high street, the way eyes would flick toward me and then away, polite but unmistakably assessing. It wasn't hostility, exactly. It was something more careful than that. Wary, the way you might be wary around someone who'd recently been bereaved. Except the wariness didn't fade the way it should have once people got used to seeing me around. If anything, it seemed to deepen, week by week, as though my continued presence in that house was itself a kind of provocation. I tried the direct approach first, over tea, in a small cafe run by a woman named Cynthia who'd been kind enough, initially, to strike up conversation about the weather and the state of the roads. "I'm up at Wraithmore," I said, watching carefully. "My aunt's house." Cynthia's hand had paused, briefly, over the teapot she was refilling, and when she looked up, her smile had gone slightly fixed, professional, in a way it hadn't been a moment before. "Lovely old place," she said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. "Big project for you, I'd think." "Did you know her, Marguerite?" To see her, yes. She kept herself to herself, mostly. Cynthia had busied herself with the teapot again, not meeting my eyes, and when I pressed gently, asked whether Marguerite had had friends in the village, whether anyone had visited her regularly, the answers came shorter and shorter, vaguer and vaguer, until eventually Cynthia found a reason to attend to another table and didn't return to mine for the rest of my visit. It became a pattern over the following days. The moment I mentioned Wraithmore close by name, faces would tighten almost imperceptibly. Eyes would drop to teacups or shopping lists or whatever happened to be nearest at hand, and the conversation would find its way, with a kind of practiced smoothness, towards some other subject entirely. Nobody was rude about it exactly. Nobody told me outright to stop asking, but the avoidance had a shape to it, a consistency, that felt learned rather than accidental, as though the whole village had agreed, at some point long before I arrived, on a policy of silence regarding that house and everything connected to it, and had maintained that policy so consistently, for so long, that it had become second nature, no longer requiring conscious thought. The closest I came to a real answer arrived almost by accident on a Wednesday afternoon in the small corner shop at the edge of the high street, where I'd taken to buying milk and the occasional loaf of bread. The shop was run by an elderly man named Mr. Kettering, who I'd exchanged pleasantries with a handful of times, without ever quite breaking through his careful, watchful courtesy. That Wednesday, though, something in him seemed to shift. Perhaps he was simply tired, or perhaps something about my expression that day, the exhaustion I was carrying after another sleepless night, prompted a kind of sympathy in him he hadn't allowed himself to show before. "You're not sleeping well," he said, not quite a question, as he rang up my purchases with hands that trembled slightly with age. "Not really, no," I admitted. He was quiet for a moment, and then, almost too quietly for me to hear, over the small bell above the door, as another customer entered and left, he said, "Your aunt asked too many questions too." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "What do you mean?" But whatever had opened in him closed again almost immediately. I watched it happen, watched his expression shutter, his hands still on the till, and when I pressed further, asked what he meant, what questions, what had happened to Marguerite that had made an entire village decide silence was safer than honesty, he simply shook his head, wouldn't meet my eyes again, and told me, in a voice gone flat and final, that he had customers waiting. I walked out of that shop with the small bell jingling behind me, and the sound of it followed me down the high street like a warning I didn't yet know how to heed. Nobody would say the family's name outright. The family, I would later understand, who'd lived at Wraithmore before Marguerite bought the house in the 70s. The family whose surname appeared over and over in that corkboard of clippings, connected by red string to decades of disappearances that the official record, as far as I could tell, had never properly linked together. But everyone's silence had the same shape, the same practiced avoidance, the same careful redirection, the same flicker of something like fear behind otherwise ordinary faces, as though the whole village had agreed, decades ago, in some conversation none of them could quite remember having, never to speak it aloud again, and had kept that agreement so faithfully for so long that the silence itself had become a kind of monument, a headstone for something nobody wanted to name. I found the photograph while clearing out the study properly, nearly 2 weeks after I'd first unlocked that door, a task I'd been putting off, returning to the room only sparingly, always with a kind of low-grade dread I couldn't quite justify to myself in daylight, but felt intensely the moment I crossed the threshold. It was tucked behind another photograph in a broken frame that had fallen or been knocked from its place on the desk. I found it while sorting through a box of assorted paperwork, the frame's glass cracked in a long diagonal line across a formal photograph of Marguerite herself, younger, perhaps in her 30s, standing stiffly in front of the same rose arbor I'd seen collapsed and overgrown in the garden. When I lifted the backing away to see if the frame could be salvaged, a second photograph slid out from behind the first, yellowed and brittle at the edges, in a way that suggested real age, decades rather than years. 5 children stood in front of the house. This house, unmistakably, though the ivy on the east wall was thinner then, and the rose arbor stood upright, heavy with blooms I couldn't identify from the black and white print. They were dressed identically, grey shorts and grey jumpers for the boys, grey pinafores for the 2 girls, an arrangement so uniform it felt less like a family portrait and more like an institutional photograph, the kind taken at a school or a home for wayward children. None of them were smiling. I remember that detail striking me before almost anything else. 5 children, presumably siblings given the resemblance in their faces, none of them smiling, none of them looking quite at the camera, their eyes all fixed at some point slightly to the left of the lens, as though something there had caught their attention and held it. On the back, in faded ink that had gone the colour of weak tea, someone had written, "The Ashworth Children, 1961, 4 returned." I read that sentence 3 times before its meaning fully landed. 4 returned, not 5. I turned the photograph back over, counted the faces in the image again, certain I'd miscounted, certain the strange phrasing on the back was simply that. Strange phrasing, an old-fashioned turn of speech I wasn't understanding correctly. But no, 5 children stood in that photograph, dressed identically, unsmiling, and someone, Marguerite, presumably, given the handwriting matched what I'd seen in the ledger and the corkboard's margin notes, had written, decades later, that only 4 of them had returned. Returned from... That was the question that sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of that afternoon, following me from room to room as I abandoned the sorting I'd been doing and simply sat, instead, on the edge of the desk, turning that small photograph over and over in my hands, as though repetition might reveal some detail I'd missed. I thought about the corkboard, the red string, the name Ashworth that I now recognized from at least 3 of the clippings pinned there. Thomas Ashworth, aged 8, last seen, and felt the pieces of something much larger than I'd initially understood, beginning to shift into a shape I didn't yet have the full picture of, but which filled me with a dread specific and physical, a tightness across my chest that made it briefly hard to draw a full breath. I sat with that sentence, 4 returned, for a long time that afternoon, the paper trembling slightly in my hand, though I told myself, in the same reflexive way I'd been telling myself things since my first night in that house, that it was simply a draft from the window, a chill working its way through old glass and older frames. But there was no draft that afternoon. The air in that study was still, heavy, the way air gets before a storm breaks, and my hands were trembling for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. That night, I dreamed of the photograph, or of something like it. 5 children standing in a garden gone dark, their faces turned towards something just outside the frame of my vision, and a voice, small and clear and utterly without warmth, counting slowly backward. 5, 4, 3. I woke gasping somewhere around 3 in the morning, certain, with a conviction that didn't fade even as full wakefulness returned to me, that someone had been standing at the foot of my bed only moments before, that I had woken not from the natural rhythm of a nightmare ending, but because whatever had been standing there had only just, reluctantly, chosen to leave. I lay awake for a long time after that, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me, the way it always seemed to at night, and I thought about that photograph, tucked now into the drawer of my own bedside table, where I'd placed it before falling asleep, unable to bring myself to leave it in the cold study downstairs. 5 children, 4 returned. I didn't yet know what had happened to the 5th, or where in this house, if anywhere, the answer might be waiting. But I understood, lying there in the dark with my heart still hammering from the dream, that I had crossed some threshold I couldn't uncross, that whatever had happened to the Ashworth children in 1961 was no longer a piece of history I could simply set aside, but something that had noticed my noticing, and had, perhaps, already begun to respond. By the second week, I had stopped sleeping properly, in any sense that word usually implies. Sleep had become something I fell into for an hour or two at a time, shallow and full of half-formed anxiety, before some sound or sensation dragged me back to full wakefulness, heart already racing before I'd even identified what had woken me. The footsteps started around then, though started might not be the right word, since I couldn't be certain, looking back, whether they were new or whether I'd simply been sleeping too soundly in that first week to notice them. Either way, by the second week I was hearing them most nights, crossing the upstairs hallway outside my bedroom door in a rhythm that took me several nights to properly pass, because my mind kept trying to explain it away as something ordinary, pipes, settling wood, the house's old bones adjusting to weather. But pipes don't have a rhythm like footsteps. And what I heard, lying rigid in my sleeping bag with the blankets pulled to my chin despite a room that wasn't especially cold, was unmistakably that. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, a light tread that some part of my brain immediately and unhelpfully categorized as a child's, mixed with something heavier following behind, a dragging sound that didn't match any rhythm a human gait should produce. Step, then drag, step, then drag, moving the length of the hallway and back, over and over, sometimes for what felt like an hour, before finally, mercifully, falling silent. I told myself that first night I properly registered the sound for what it was, that it was pipes settling, the house adjusting to new weight, my presence, after however many months or years it had stood there mostly empty, its systems cooling and cracking without anyone to notice or care. I lay there, counting my own heartbeat, a technique I'd read about somewhere for managing anxiety, and waited for the sound to stop, which it eventually did, sometime past 2 in the morning, leaving a silence in its wake that felt, if anything, more oppressive than the footsteps had. I didn't investigate that first night. I want to be honest about that too. I lay there, awake and afraid, and did nothing, because some deep and ancient part of my brain understood, even before the rest of me caught up, that investigating might mean confirming something I badly did not want confirmed. But the footsteps returned the next night, and the night after that, with a regularity that eventually eroded my capacity for denial entirely. It was on the 4th or 5th night, I'd lost precise count by then, the days blurring together in the particular exhaustion of chronic sleeplessness, that I finally found the courage, or perhaps simply the desperation, to open my bedroom door and look. The hallway was empty, of course. I'd expected that, in some sense, and yet the emptiness itself felt wrong, felt like the aftermath of a presence rather than the simple absence of one. The air held a chill it hadn't held earlier in the evening, and there was a faint, sweetish smell drifting toward me from the direction of the principal bedroom that I recognized immediately, my stomach dropping at the familiarity of it. It was the footprints that finally broke something loose in my carefully maintained denial. I found them a few nights later, stepping out into the hallway, after another round of that terrible step and drag rhythm had finally fallen silent, my phone's torch beam catching something on the floorboards that made me freeze entirely, breath caught somewhere in my throat. Small, damp footprints. A child's footprints, unmistakably, the toes and heel clearly defined against the dry, dusty wood, leading from the direction of the locked study downstairs. Though how footprints could travel from the ground floor to the first floor, without any corresponding marks on the staircase, I couldn't begin to explain, up the hallway toward my own bedroom door. They stopped, not at the door itself, but a few feet short of it, in a way that unsettled me even more than the footprints' mere existence. They didn't fade the way you'd expect footprints to fade, moisture drying gradually into fainter and fainter impressions as whatever had made them moved further from wherever the water had originated. They simply stopped. One footprint, fully formed, damp enough that I could see it glistening faintly in my torch's beam, and then nothing beyond it. No trailing off, no gradual diminishment, just an abrupt, absolute cessation, as though whatever had made that final footprint had, in the same instant, ceased to have feet at all, as though it had lifted straight up into the air, in that spot, and simply vanished into the ceiling above. I stood there for a long time, torch beam trembling slightly across that last footprint, and I found myself doing something I hadn't done since childhood, counting, silently, backward from 10, a technique some long-forgotten adult had taught me for managing fear, as though reaching 0 might somehow undo what I was looking at. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat on my bed with the door locked, though I understood even then, with a kind of sick clarity, that a lock had never been the thing keeping whatever walked those halls at bay. My younger sister, Rosalind, called that week, the first time we'd spoken properly in months, since a fight at our mother's funeral that had left both of us saying things we'd never quite managed to take back. I remember staring at her name on my phone's screen for a long moment, before answering, surprised by how much I wanted to hear her voice, given how carefully I'd avoided thinking about her, about that fight, about the particular guilt I carried regarding my own family that seemed, that week, to be compounding on top of the guilt I already carried about Marguerite. "Hey," she said, when I finally answered, and something in the small, uncertain way she said it, none of the sharpness that had characterized our last conversation, cracked something open in my chest that I hadn't realized was still so tightly closed. We talked for a while about nothing in particular, the careful, tentative small talk of two people testing whether a bridge that had been badly damaged might still hold weight. And then, almost as an afterthought, in a tone that tried and failed to sound casual, she said, "I keep thinking about Aunt Marguerite." "Yeah," I said. "Me too. Mum told me something once," Rosalind continued, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully, the way she did when she was uncertain whether something was worth saying at all. Years ago, that she'd asked Marguerite to stop digging into something, before we were born even. I don't know why it's been in my head lately. I felt that cold, settling sensation again, the same one Mr. Kettering's careful comment had produced in me at the corner shop. Digging into what? I don't know. Mum never said, not properly. She got this look, whenever it came up, like she really didn't want to talk about it. And she made me promise, once, ages ago, never to visit that house. I always thought it was just some old family falling out. You know how these things get. Nobody actually explains anything. They just pass the awkwardness down like an heirloom. I didn't tell her, in that moment, that I was already living there. I don't fully understand, even now, why I held that back. Some instinct, I think, that speaking it aloud would make the growing dread I was carrying feel more real, more shared, harder to dismiss as my own overtired imagination running away with me. I certainly didn't tell her about the footprints, or the smell, or the photograph now sitting in my bedside drawer with its terrible 2-word inscription. I let her believe I was simply handling the paperwork remotely, sorting things out from a distance, the way any reasonable person might. "Do you think Mum knew something happened to her?" Rosalind asked, after a pause. "Marguerite, I mean. Something that made her, I don't know, the way she got, withdrawn. All those weird cards that stopped making sense toward the end." I thought about the corkboard. I thought about 4 returned. I thought about the ledger I hadn't yet found, sitting locked in that desk drawer waiting for me, though I didn't know it yet. "I think something happened, yeah," I said finally, carefully. "I don't know what." We talked a little longer, the conversation drifting back towards safer ground, an unspoken agreement between us to step back from whatever uncomfortable territory we'd briefly wandered into. But after we hung up, I sat for a long time in the kitchen, phone still warm in my hand, turning over what she'd said. She made me promise never to visit that house. Our mother, dead now herself for going on 3 years, had apparently understood something about Wraithmore Close, specific enough, serious enough, to extract a promise from her youngest daughter, a promise Rosalind had kept faithfully, without ever fully understanding why, until a house she'd never seen became, without her knowledge, her own sister's home. I thought about calling her back. I thought about telling her everything. The smell, the footsteps, the photograph, the way an entire village flinched at the mention of this address. But I didn't. I told myself I was protecting her, sparing her a fear I hadn't yet fully confirmed was warranted. I understand now, looking back, that I was also protecting myself, that saying it aloud to someone who loved me would have meant admitting how frightened I actually was, and some proud, foolish part of me wasn't ready to admit that yet, not even to my own sister, not even after everything that had already happened. I went to bed that night thinking about her voice, small and uncertain on the phone, and about the promise our mother had extracted from her all those years ago. I didn't know yet how much that promise would come to matter, or how strange and terrible the circumstances would be under which I would eventually hear my sister's voice again. I finally forced the writing desk's locked drawer open on a Sunday, using a flathead screwdriver I'd bought specifically for the task, guilt and dread rising together in my throat, with each small, splintering give of old wood against metal. I'd known the drawer was there since my first visit to the study, a shallow compartment beneath the desk's main writing surface, secured with a small brass lock that none of Mrs. Pell's keys had fit, and I'd avoided it for nearly a week after finding the photograph, some part of me understanding, correctly as it turned out, that whatever waited inside would only deepen the dread I was already struggling to manage. The drawer finally splintered open with a crack that seemed too loud for the quiet house, and inside I found a ledger, leather-bound, heavy, its pages soft with handling, despite being kept locked away, which told its own story about how often Marguerite must have taken it out, read it, added to it, before locking it away again each time. Her handwriting filled every page, cramped and urgent in a way that seemed to accelerate as the entries progressed chronologically, as though whatever she'd been documenting had, over the years, begun to feel less like careful research and more like a race against something she was struggling to keep pace with. Dates, names. Not just the 5 Ashworth children whose photograph I'd already found, but dozens more, spanning generations, names going back, I realized as I worked through the earlier pages, to the 1920s, and continuing forward in irregular but persistent intervals, right up until the final entries, which I would come to understand were dated mere days before Marguerite's death. Each entry followed a similar pattern, a name, a date, a brief description of circumstances, and then a note, in Marguerite's increasingly urgent hand, describing the disappearance or death as consistent with prior incidents, a phrase that recurred so often throughout the ledger that it began to feel less like an observation and more like an incantation, something she was repeating to herself as much as recording for any future reader. I sat at that desk for hours, working through page after page, the cold study around me, forgotten, as the scope of what my aunt had spent decades documenting became clear. She hadn't been eccentric, whatever the family had quietly agreed to believe about her over the years. Whatever polite fiction had allowed everyone to stop asking after her without guilt. She'd been documenting something methodically, obsessively, patiently, for the better part of her adult life, a pattern of disappearances and deaths connected to this house, to this small radius of village and hillside that stretched back further than any living memory could account for, and that she clearly believed had continued, uninterrupted, right up until the very end of her own life. The ledger's earlier entries were careful, almost academic in tone, dates cross-referenced with newspaper archives, parish records, interviews she'd apparently conducted with elderly villagers, whose names I recognized from my own increasingly frustrating attempts to get anyone in the village to talk to me. But as the pages progressed, the tone shifted, became more personal, more frightened. By the entries dated within the last 5 years of her life, the handwriting had deteriorated into something closer to a frantic scrawl, words crossed out and rewritten, margins filled with notes that seemed to contradict or qualify the main text in ways that suggested a mind under genuine, sustained siege. I found myself thinking, as I worked through those later pages, about the birthday cards that had grown shorter and stranger over the years, before stopping altogether. Cards I'd barely glanced at, in my own careless 20s, before setting them aside for whatever gift card had been tucked inside. I wondered, with a guilt that settled cold and heavy alongside the dread I was already carrying, whether those cards had been Marguerite's attempt to reach out, in whatever diminished way this house, and whatever haunted it, had left available to her, and whether I might have noticed, might have asked, might have done something, if I'd simply paid closer attention. The final entry in the ledger was dated 3 days before her death, a detail the coroner's report, which I'd requested and received earlier that week, described simply as natural causes, likely cardiac, with no further elaboration, no acknowledgement of a locked study, a corkboard of clippings, or a ledger documenting decades of connected disappearances that any competent investigation might have found significant. I didn't read that final entry that day. I want to be honest about that too. I found it, saw the date, saw the way the handwriting on that last page differed so markedly from everything that preceded it, and I closed the ledger, sat with it heavy in my lap for a long moment, and decided I wasn't yet ready to know what it said. I locked the study behind me when I left, though I kept the ledger with me this time, carrying it upstairs to my own room, where it sat on the bedside table, beside the photograph of 5 unsmiling children, both of them waiting, patiently, for the night I would finally find the courage to read what Marguerite had written in the last, terrible days of her life. I read the final entry 3 nights later, unable to put it off any longer, some combination of exhaustion and a dread that had begun to feel less like fear of the unknown and more like the anticipation of a diagnosis I already suspected, finally driving me to open the ledger to its last written page. The handwriting, which had been deteriorating steadily throughout the later portions of the ledger, gave way entirely on that final page to something closer to a frantic scrawl, ink pressed so hard into the paper in places that it had torn slightly, words crossed out and rewritten with a haste that suggested Marguerite had been racing against some clock only she could see. "It knows I know," the entry began. No preamble, no context, as though continuing a thought from a conversation I hadn't been present for. It's been in the walls since before the Ashworths. Longer, I think, though I can't find records before 1911, and even those are fragmentary. It doesn't take you all at once. That's what I misunderstood. For years, why the pattern never seemed to make sense. It waits, it collects, it keeps one thread of you here, in this house, so the rest of you never truly leave, no matter how far you think you've gone. I should never have brought her into this house. I told myself it would be different, that love could be a kind of shelter, but I understand now that I only gave it something new to keep. Forgive me. The entry ended there, mid-thought it seemed, the pen, apparently lifted from the page, without completing whatever sentence had been forming. I sat with that word, her, until it blurred on the page in front of me, my own eyes swimming with a fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. Marguerite had no children. That fact had been established, gently, by Mrs. Pell during our initial meeting, part of the explanation for why the estate had passed to me, rather than to any more obvious heir. But I found myself remembering, with a clarity that surprised me, a Christmas from years earlier. I couldn't have been older than 12 or 13, when my mother, several glasses of wine deep into an evening that had otherwise been unremarkable, had mentioned, almost in passing, that Marguerite had fostered a little girl once, briefly, back in the 70s, before something had happened and the arrangement had ended, and Marguerite had never spoken of it again. I hadn't thought about that comment in years. It had been the kind of half-remembered family fragment that surfaces occasionally and then sinks back beneath the surface of ordinary life, unremarkable, unexamined. But sitting in that cold house, with the ledger open in my lap, I felt it surface again with an entirely different weight, an entirely different significance. I should never have brought her into this house. I got up from the bed, ledger still in hand, and went to the window, looking out at the dark shape of the overgrown garden below, the collapsed rose arbor, barely visible in the thin moonlight filtering through cloud cover. I thought about the photograph, 5 children, 4 returned, and wondered, with a dread that had begun to feel less like speculation and more like the slow assembly of a picture whose final shape I was beginning to dread, whether Marguerite's foster daughter had ever properly left this house at all, in any sense that mattered. I didn't sleep that night, not properly. I sat up in bed with the ledger closed beside me, listening to the familiar rhythm of footsteps in the hallway begin somewhere around midnight. Step, then drag. Step, then drag. And I found myself, for the first time since I'd started hearing that sound, wondering whether it belonged to one of the Ashworth children or to someone else entirely. Someone Marguerite herself had brought into this house, decades ago, in an act of love that the house had received, apparently not as a gift, but as an offering. I thought about calling Rosalind. I thought about calling Mrs. Pell, demanding answers I suspected she didn't fully have to give. I thought, more than once that long night, about simply leaving, walking out to my car in the dark and driving until the house was nothing but a shape in the rearview mirror, letting some other version of myself deal with the paperwork remotely, from a safe distance, the way I'd let Rosalind believe I'd been doing all along. I didn't leave. I want to be honest about that too, about the particular stubbornness, or guilt, or grief, that kept me in that house, through that long, sleepless night, and the many that followed. I told myself I owed Marguerite the truth, after 11 years of silence I'd allowed to calcify into something neither of us had ever properly addressed. I told myself I needed to understand what had happened to her, what she'd spent decades trying to warn a family that had stopped listening to her long before she stopped writing. I told myself these things, lying awake in that dark house, with the footsteps pacing the hallway outside my door, and I believed them, mostly, even as some smaller, quieter part of me understood that the house itself had already begun, in whatever patient, ancient way it operated, to make the decision for me. Something about that final entry sent me back upstairs the following afternoon, hands still faintly trembling as I moved from room to room with a tape measure I'd found in a kitchen drawer, measuring the study wall against the corresponding stretch of hallway above it, with an urgency I couldn't fully explain, even to myself, until the numbers refused to align. 3 feet of space unaccounted for. I measured twice, then a third time, standing in the principal bedroom, with the tape measure stretched from the outer wall to the heavy oak wardrobe pushed against its far side, and then again in the hallway outside, comparing the figures against a rough sketch I'd made of the ground floor study directly beneath. The discrepancy was undeniable. 3 feet of the house's interior volume that existed on no floor plan, accounted for by no room I'd yet discovered. A gap that could only mean one thing, given the layout of walls and doorways I'd spent the better part of a month becoming intimately familiar with. The wardrobe was heavier than it looked, dark wood swollen slightly with age, and it took considerable effort to shift it even a few inches from the wall behind it. Effort that left me breathless, sweating despite the room's persistent chill, my hands scraped raw against old, splintering wood. But once I'd created enough of a gap to see behind it properly, my torch beam caught something that stopped my breath entirely. A door. Small, child-sized. I registered immediately, no more than 4 feet in height, set into the wall behind the wardrobe and painted over so many times, in layers of paint gone thick and uneven with age, that it had effectively become part of the wall itself, its outline barely distinguishable except where the most recent layer of paint had begun to crack and flake, revealing the scene beneath. I worked at that door for the better part of an hour, using the same screwdriver I'd taken to the desk drawer, scraping away decades of accumulated paint until the outline of a small brass handle emerged, and then, with considerably more force than I'd expected to need, prying the door itself loose from a frame that had swollen tight against it over the years. It swung open into darkness, so complete that my torch beam seemed almost to struggle against it, illuminating only a small circle of space directly ahead, while the rest of the room beyond remained stubbornly, unnaturally dark. I crawled through. The doorway was too small to enter any other way, and found myself in a narrow room, low-ceilinged, no more than 8 feet by 6, that had clearly, once, been someone's bedroom. A child's bed stood against the far wall, small and old-fashioned, its frame painted white, though the paint had yellowed considerably with age. And arranged around it, on shelves and across a small rag rug in the center of the floor, were toys, dozens of them, arranged with an obsessive, deliberate care that struck me immediately as wrong, in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Not scattered the way a child's toys naturally accumulate through play, placed, positioned. A porcelain doll seated in a small wooden chair, its painted eyes fixed on the doorway I'd just crawled through. Wooden blocks stacked in a precise, undisturbed tower. A stuffed rabbit, worn nearly bald with handling, propped against the pillow of that small, waiting bed. It looked, more than anything, like a room that had been maintained, not abandoned, not simply left to gather dust, but actively kept, tended, over what must have been decades, by someone who wanted it ready, at all times, for an occupant who might return at any moment. And on the wall above the bed, scratched deep into the plaster in letters that varied wildly in size and neatness, as though written and rewritten many times over many years, was a single word, repeated dozens of times, filling nearly the entire surface. Wait, 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 wait. Not a name, not a plea for help, not a cry for rescue, nothing that read as the desperate message of a child trying to communicate with whoever might eventually find this room. An instruction, something being told, over and over, to wait. Though whether the word had been scratched there by whatever child had once occupied this space, or by someone else entirely, instructing that child, I couldn't begin to guess. I knelt in that small, cold room for a long time, torch beam trembling slightly across those repeated letters, and I felt, with a certainty I couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely, that I was not alone in that space, that something in the room's stillness was not the stillness of true emptiness, but the stillness of something holding very carefully still, waiting to see what I would do next. I backed out slowly, the way you might back away from a sleeping animal you didn't want to startle, and it wasn't until I was fully back in the principal bedroom, wardrobe pushed only part-way back into place, that I allowed myself to breathe properly again. I sat on the edge of that too-neat 4-poster bed for a long time afterward, and I understood, with a clarity that felt less like realization and more like something being permitted to surface in my mind, that whatever waited in that small room behind the wardrobe had been waiting a very long time indeed, and that the word, scratched so many times into that plaster, had not, perhaps, been a message left for the child who once slept there, but an instruction that child was still, in whatever fashion the dead or the trapped are capable of obedience, faithfully following. I went back into that small room 3 days later, against every instinct that told me not to, driven by a compulsion I still find difficult to fully articulate, a need to understand, to see clearly, that had begun to outweigh even my own considerable and well-earned fear. It was late afternoon when I crawled back through that low doorway, deliberately choosing daylight hours over the darkness that had accompanied my first discovery, some part of me believing, foolishly, that sunlight might render the space more manageable, less charged with whatever presence I'd sensed there before. The light that filtered in behind me from the principal bedroom illuminated the space more thoroughly than my torch had managed, and I could see, in that better light, details I'd missed before. A small chest of drawers in the corner, its contents, when I eventually worked up the courage to check, consisting entirely of neatly folded children's clothing, grey shorts and grey pinafores that matched, with a precision that made my chest tighten, the clothing worn by the 5 children in that old photograph. I was kneeling by the chest of drawers, examining a small grey jumper with numb, careful hands, when the temperature dropped. It happened suddenly, without any of the gradual chill I might have attributed to a draft finding its way in from some unseen gap. One moment, the room held the same faintly musty warmth as the rest of the house's upper floor, and the next, my breath was fogging visibly in front of my face, though it was mid-July outside, the hottest week of the summer so far according to the radio I'd left playing in the kitchen. I felt it before I properly registered it intellectually. A pressure change in the small room, like the specific sensation of a held breath being released very close to your ear, close enough that you feel the warmth of it against your skin, even though no warmth should logically follow from air that cold. The toys on the shelf trembled. I watched it happen, my whole body gone rigid with a fear that had moved past thought and into something closer to pure animal alertness. The porcelain doll's small wooden chair rocking slightly, the stacked blocks shifting, one toppling from its precise tower to land with a small, dry clatter on the rag rug below. No window stood open anywhere in that sealed, windowless little room. There was no mechanism I could identify, no rational explanation my exhausted, terrified mind could produce quickly enough to hold back the wave of pure, primal dread that was building in my chest. And then, very softly, close enough that I felt it as much as heard it, a child's voice spoke a name. Not my name, not Rosalind's name, not any name I recognized from the ledger's careful, methodical pages, not any name connected to the Ashworth children whose photograph sat in my bedside drawer 2 rooms away. A single word, spoken with a gentleness that somehow made it more terrible than any scream could have been. A soft, almost affectionate utterance, as though the voice speaking it had been waiting a very long time for the chance to say it aloud again. Iris. I don't know how long I knelt there afterward, frozen, the cold slowly beginning to recede back into ordinary summer warmth around me, the toys settling back into their positions of careful, deliberate stillness, as though nothing had disturbed them at all. I don't remember crawling back out through that small doorway, or pushing the wardrobe fully back into place, or making my way downstairs to sit, shaking, at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink cooling in front of me. I spent that evening, and much of the following day, digging through parish records I'd requested weeks earlier and only just received, working through baptism registers and school enrollment books, with a focus that felt, by that point, less like curiosity and more like desperation. I found her eventually, in a school register from the mid-1970s. Iris, no surname listed initially, a temporary foster placement noted in the margin in a clerk's careful hand, address given as Wraithmore Close. The foster child my mother had mentioned, once, at a long ago Christmas, in a comment I'd let slip past me, unexamined for over a decade. Iris had been 8 years old according to the register. 8 years old, placed in Marguerite's care for what the records described only as an interim period, with no further entries after the autumn term of 1976, no record of where she'd gone, no note of the placement's formal end. She simply appeared in the records once, briefly, and then vanished from them entirely, the way a stone vanishes beneath water, a small disturbance on the surface, and then nothing. The one who never left this house, not really. That understanding settled into me that evening with a weight I still find hard to describe, sitting alone in that kitchen with the parish records spread across the table in front of me, and the small, cold room behind the wardrobe waiting, patiently, 2 floors above. I went outside the next morning, desperate for something ordinary, air that hadn't been breathed and rebreathed within those old walls, sunlight that didn't filter down through dust-heavy windows, ground beneath my feet that didn't creak and shift with the particular, deliberate rhythm I'd come to dread. The garden, overgrown as it was, felt like the only remaining space in the entire property that hadn't yet revealed some terrible secret, and I threw myself into clearing it with an energy that was, I understand now, as much about avoidance as it was about any genuine desire to see the grounds restored. I started with what I'd assumed, on first arrival, was an old flower bed, a raised, rectangular patch near the collapsed rose arbor, bordered by a low stone edge gone green with moss. Its interior, a tangle of weeds so thick I couldn't tell what, if anything, had originally been planted there. I worked at it for the better part of an hour, pulling bramble and nettle with gloved hands, building up a rhythm of physical labor that felt, for a while, genuinely therapeutic. The first stretch of time in weeks where my mind had been able to focus on something as simple and unambiguous as clearing weeds. My trowel struck something that wasn't stone about 18 inches down, the resistance different enough from the packed earth and root systems I'd been working through that I noticed it immediately, some part of me already understanding, before I'd consciously registered what I was looking at, that I'd found something significant. I worked more carefully after that, using my gloved hands rather than the trowel, brushing soil away in small, careful increments, the way I imagined an archaeologist might approach a dig, though nothing in my actual training had prepared me for what emerged, gradually, from that dark earth. Small bones. I recognized them immediately for what they were, some instinct refusing to let me retreat into denial the way I had, so many times before, in that house, refusing to let me tell myself they were animal remains, a long-dead pet, anything other than the truth my hands were uncovering with each careful pass through the soil. They weren't scattered the way remains buried in panic or haste typically are, weren't jumbled together in the chaotic way I understood, from half-remembered documentaries, that hurried burials tended to look. They were arranged, placed with the same eerie, deliberate care I'd already seen in the toys arranged around that small child's bed behind the wardrobe. Small bones positioned in a pattern that felt, the longer I looked at it, less like a burial and more like an offering, something laid out with reverence rather than concealment. I sat back in the wet grass. It had begun to rain while I worked, a fine, persistent drizzle I'd barely registered until that moment, and I understood, with a horrible, sinking clarity that settled through my whole body like cold water, that Marguerite hadn't simply documented this house's history from a careful, scholarly distance. She had been its final caretaker. She had tended this garden, this small, terrible flower bed, in whatever fashion the situation had demanded of her, for years, possibly decades, maintaining something that had been growing here, patiently, quietly, for far longer than any single lifetime could account for. I thought about the ledger's entries, spanning back to 1911. I thought about the corkboard, red string connecting decade after decade of names. I thought about the photograph, 5 children, 4 returned. And about Iris, 8 years old, appearing once in a school register and then vanishing from every subsequent record, as though she'd simply ceased to exist. I thought about the words scratched over and over into that plaster wall, wait, 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 and understood, kneeling there in the rain with dark, damp earth still clinging to my gloves, that I had been looking at this entirely wrong from the beginning. This wasn't a haunting in the sense I'd been unconsciously imagining, some restless spirit seeking resolution or revenge, something that might eventually be satisfied and allowed to rest. This was cultivation. Something had been growing in this house, in this garden, for over a century, tended first by whoever had lived here before the Ashworths, then by the Ashworths themselves, in whatever unwitting or complicit fashion their own tragedy had demanded. And then by Marguerite, my aunt, whom I had judged, in my careless 20s, as simply eccentric, withdrawn, not worth the effort of maintaining a relationship with, who had apparently spent the final decades of her life as this thing's reluctant, terrified. I covered the bones back over as carefully as I'd uncovered them, some instinct insisting that disturbing them further, removing them from wherever they'd been so deliberately placed, would invite a response I wasn't prepared to face. I went back inside, soaked through, mud-streaked, and sat in the kitchen for a long time without moving, listening to the rain against the windows and turning over, in my exhausted mind, the terrible new shape of understanding I'd carried in from the garden. The rain drove me back inside for good that evening, and in the harsh, unforgiving light of the kitchen, the one room in the house I'd fitted with a proper modern bulb, bright enough to banish shadow almost entirely, I forced myself to reread the ledger's margins with a thoroughness I hadn't managed on my first pass, when the main entries had commanded all my attention. Marguerite had filled every available inch of white space with smaller, hastier annotations, cross-references, dates, half-formed theories she'd apparently returned to revise and expand over the years, so that some pages carried 3 or 4 layers of handwriting in different inks, different states of urgency, built up over what must have been decades of returning to the same material with fresh eyes and deepening dread. I'd dismissed most of these margin notes on my first read as paranoid scribbling, the understandable but ultimately unreliable output of a mind that had spent too many years alone, with a terrible suspicion, isolated from anyone who might have offered perspective or challenge. But rereading them that evening, with the small bones from the garden still fresh in my mind, they read entirely differently. One line, tucked into the margin beside an entry from the early 1990s, stopped me cold, my whole body going still around it, the way it might around a sound in the dark. "It doesn't live in the house," Marguerite had written, the ink slightly smudged, as though she'd paused mid-sentence, perhaps to collect herself before continuing. "It lives in the bloodline. The house is only where it feeds." I read that sentence perhaps a dozen times, my mind working through its implications with a slow, reluctant thoroughness, resisting the conclusion it was clearly building toward, even as that conclusion became increasingly impossible to avoid. My family. Not the Ashworths specifically, not some cursed address I'd inherited entirely by chance, unconnected to anything but the accident of Marguerite's will. If the house was merely where this thing fed, rather than where it lived, then the actual site of its true, sustaining connection had to be something else. Something that could explain how it had persisted across owners, across families, across the better part of a century, feeding on one bloodline after another, rather than simply haunting a single fixed address. I went back through the ledger with new eyes, cross-referencing names against a rough family tree I'd begun sketching out weeks earlier, mostly out of idle curiosity about Marguerite's side of the family, a project I'd since abandoned in favor of more pressing concerns. And there, buried in an entry I'd skimmed too quickly on my first read, I found the detail that reorganized everything I thought I understood about my own connection to this house. Marguerite had married into our family relatively late in life, a fact I'd known distantly, without ever properly examining its implications. She'd married my great-uncle in 1979, 3 years after the school register showed Iris's placement ending without formal record. And Iris, the records showed, when I finally found the right documents, buried in a box of Marguerite's personal papers I'd been avoiding for weeks, had shared our family's surname before her adoption into a different family entirely, a detail that had been quietly, deliberately obscured in every record I'd previously encountered, as though someone, at some point, had gone to considerable effort to sever that connection from the official documentation. Iris hadn't been a stranger this house had simply happened to consume, an unfortunate foster child caught up in a tragedy unconnected to my own family's history. Iris had been blood, a distant cousin, several times removed, connected to my own family tree in a way that had been carefully, deliberately hidden, buried under decades of silence and half-truths that I was only now beginning to understand the true purpose of. Which meant, I understood, sitting in that harshly lit kitchen with rain still hammering against the windows and the ledger open in front of me like an accusation that whatever waited in the walls of this house, whatever had scratched weight into that plaster over and over, whatever voice had spoken a dead girl's name to me in a cold, sealed room, had not been waiting for just anyone unfortunate enough to move into this house. It had been waiting, specifically, patiently, for us, for our bloodline, for whoever among us might eventually come close enough, curious enough, connected enough by blood to be worth the wait. I thought about my mother's insistence that Rosalind never visit this house. I thought about the birthday cards that grew shorter and stranger over the years, Marguerite's own increasingly desperate attempts to maintain some distance between the family she'd married into and the things she'd spent decades trying to contain. And I thought, with a dread that had moved past fear into something closer to grim, exhausted certainty, about the fact that I was sitting in this house right now, not a stranger, not an unfortunate accident of inheritance, but exactly what this house, whatever inhabited it, had apparently been waiting for all along. My phone rang again that night, well past midnight, Rosalind's name lighting up the screen in the darkness of my bedroom with a suddenness that made my heart lurch painfully before I'd even registered what I was seeing. I answered immediately, some instinct overriding the caution I might otherwise have exercised at that hour, given everything I now understood about what this house was capable of, what it might be willing to do to reach beyond its own walls. The line was full of static from the moment I picked up, not the ordinary crackle of poor signal, but something denser, more textured, like the sound of rain heard through a badly tuned radio. And beneath that static, faint but unmistakable, I heard Rosalind's voice, saying my name the exact way she used to when we were children, small and frightened in the dark, calling for me to check under her bed for whatever monster her overactive imagination had conjured that particular night. "I'm scared," the voice said, layered under that thick static, and something in its tone, younger than Rosalind's actual voice, had sounded on the phone just days earlier, pitched with a childlike quality that didn't quite match the adult woman I knew my sister to be, sent ice through my whole body. "Can you come check, please?" I said her name, said it again, asked if she was okay, my own voice climbing toward panic in a way I couldn't fully control. The static swelled, swallowing whatever response might have followed, and the call dropped entirely a moment later, the screen returning to its ordinary home display, as though nothing at all had happened. I called her back immediately, hands shaking so badly I fumbled the phone twice before managing to get the call through. She answered groggy, confused, her voice thick with genuine ordinary sleep, nothing like the thin, frightened voice I'd just heard through that wall of static. "What's wrong?" she asked, alarm creeping into her voice as she registered the hour, the fact that I was calling at all at this time of night. "Are you okay? Did you just call me?" I asked, though I already knew, with a sinking certainty, what her answer would be. "No, I was asleep. I've been asleep for hours. What's going on?" I told her, haltingly, some version of the truth, that I thought I'd received a call from her, that it must have been a mistake, some glitch in the network, anything that might account for what I'd just heard, without requiring me to explain the full, terrible truth of what I now understood about this house and its connection to our family. She sounded genuinely bewildered, genuinely untroubled by whatever had just happened on my end, and something in that bewilderment frightened me more than outright alarm might have. "I haven't thought about that house in years," she said, when I asked, carefully, whether Wraithmore Close had been on her mind at all recently. Not since Mum made me promise. Why do you keep asking about it? And then, faint but unmistakable beneath her drowsy, confused voice, I heard it, a dripping sound, slow and rhythmic, water striking some hard surface in a pattern I recognized immediately, with a jolt of pure horror, as the exact rhythm of a persistent leak in the ceiling of Wraithmore's locked study, a leak I'd been meaning to have looked at for weeks, that dripped, steadily, into a bucket I'd placed beneath it during my very first week in the house. "Rose," I said, my voice barely steady, "where are you right now?" "In bed," she said, sounding increasingly confused, and, beneath that confusion, beginning to sound frightened herself, picking up on something in my tone that she couldn't yet name. "In my flat." "Why? What's that sound? Is that on your end?" I told her it was nothing, that the line must be crossing somehow, that I'd let her get back to sleep. I don't know if she believed me. I don't think I entirely believed myself. We hung up a few minutes later, and I sat alone in the dark of my bedroom for a long time afterward, listening for any further sound from my phone, any further trace of that thin, frightened, childlike version of my sister's voice. While somewhere below me, in a locked study I hadn't visited in days, a leak continued its patient, rhythmic dripping into the dark. I haven't told Rosalind about the small room behind the wardrobe, or the bones in the garden, or the name scratched over and over into that plaster wall. I've started drafting the words a dozen times, texts I never send, the beginning of phone calls I abandon before dialing, and each time, some part of me pulls back, unwilling or unable to give this thing the confirmation of being spoken aloud to the one person I most want to protect from it. I don't fully know how to explain, even to myself, what's happened to me over these past weeks. I've started sleeping in the child-sized bed some nights, crawling through that low doorway with a blanket and pillow, because my own bedroom, 2 rooms away, has come to feel somehow less safe than that small, cold space I once found so terrifying. I've started noticing when the toys have been moved, a shift in the porcelain doll's angle, the wooden blocks restacked in a slightly different order. And instead of the horror that discovery once produced in me, I find myself, quietly, without quite admitting it to myself in the moment, arranging them back into their proper places, tending them, the way, I now understand, Marguerite must have tended them for years, in whatever fashion this house, and whatever inhabits it, demanded of her. I've stopped hearing the footsteps as something to fear, exactly. They still cross the hallway most nights, step and drag, but I lie there now with something closer to recognition than dread, an awareness that some part of me has begun to feel less like an intruder in this house, less like a reluctant caretaker forced into a role I never asked for, and more like something being slowly, patiently, carefully invited to stay, to take up whatever position Marguerite occupied for so many decades, tending a garden that has been growing here, quietly, since long before either of us was born. I read Marguerite's final ledger entry again last night, for what must be the 20th time since I first found it, that unfinished sentence, ink smeared as though her hand had been pulled away mid-thought before she could complete whatever final warning or confession she'd been attempting to leave behind. I think about that unfinished sentence every night now, lying awake in the dark, wondering what word might have come next, what final understanding she carried with her that she never managed to set down on paper. I think about Rosalind's voice on that terrible late-night call, small, frightened, unmistakably a child's voice, layered beneath the static, calling my name the way she used to, when we were young enough to still believe I could keep the monsters away, simply by checking under a bed. I think about the dripping I heard behind her sleepy, confused voice, the exact rhythm of a leak in a locked study 400 miles from where she actually lay sleeping, undisturbed, unaware. I haven't called her back to ask if it's happened again. I tell myself that's protective silence, The same instinct that's kept me from explaining any of this properly, from warning her the way I now understand, with a clarity that arrived far too late to help my aunt, that she deserves to be warned. But some nights, lying in that small child's bed with the toys arranged carefully around me, and the word wait scratched into the plaster just above my head, I wonder whether my silence is protective at all, or whether it's something else entirely, whether some part of this house, working through me now the way it worked through Marguerite before me, wants very much for Rosalind to stay exactly where she is, 400 miles away, safe for now, waiting. The dripping in the study hasn't stopped. I checked again this morning, and the bucket I placed there weeks ago has needed emptying every single day since. A slow, patient accumulation that never seems to match the actual rainfall outside, that continues even on the driest days, as though something behind that ceiling has decided the house needs to keep making its presence known, needs to keep reminding whoever listens that it hasn't finished waiting yet and isn't planning to stop.